So in this talk, I'm going to talk about the teaching intervention ideas, and I'm starting here just to provide a bit of context before we go into the second part, which is how these interventions can be disseminated as education research. And so where I start is with the teaching, looking at the different examples. And where my examples really stem from is this book. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend. It came out in 2010, and it's How Learning Works. And within this text, there's a section on what really drives or leads to motivation. And what the authors have justified through the literature is that it comes down to three things. One is value identification. So in this case, students can see value in what they're doing. The second one is self-efficacy, which can happen through skill development. And then the third one is through a supportive environment. So what I strive to do when I have my assignments that I'm creating, my innovative interventions, is that in order to get to that bottom right-hand corner, what we need to have is a supportive environment. Students need to see value, and that self-efficacy needs to be high. And those three things will drive motivation. So what I strive to do is when I create assignments, I want to make sure that students can identify value in what they're doing, that there's some skill development, and that students can ultimately cultivate that ecosystem on their own. So because of these three, I'm going to use these three as examples for these innovative teaching ideas. So first, with value identification. When it comes to value identification, we can look at this either from a company perspective or a personal perspective. So when we connect what we're doing in the classroom, we can connect it to the real world, like through businesses, but we can also connect it to how it might provide value to us personally. So just as some examples, with respect to value identification when it comes to companies. Here's an example of a mission, vision, and values, strategic themes, and results. Every company has a mission statement. So this is something that students can look up or look into and see how it connects to the classroom. As a second example, online discussion prompts can be used to help students connect the course content and to ensure that connection between the course content and the real world. So in order to do online discussion prompts, they typically have 4 components. That learning objective, so that ensures that we're actually integrating it into the course content. A hook, which could be a short video or reading or a podcast, which actually hooks or engages the students. An initial prompt, which tells students what to write about, and then a response prompt. So this encourages or perhaps requires students to participate in the discussion. And then the third example here is a personal mission statement. So in this example, on the left is a Mad Libs type approach, and on the right is a filled-in document. And so some ideas for curriculum integration are shown here. The first one is we could assign students to research companies who have a mission, vision, and strategy that's related to the course topic. Or we could assign students to participate in online discussions, and again, that's promoting the connection between theory and the real world. And then the third idea here is that we could assign students to write their own personal mission statement, integrating the program learning outcomes. Moving on to skill development. When it comes to skill development, there's 3 core areas I like to look at to integrate into the classroom. One is self-efficacy, so increasing skill development with respect to what students know how to do. The second area I like to increase skill development is in resourcefulness. So even if the students don't know how to do it, at least they can learn that they have access to it or understand that there are resources available where they can learn how. And then the third one is the growth mindset, the I can learn how. So even if I don't know how, and if I don't have access to it, then this is where the growth mindset comes in, is that I know that I can figure out what the access is to so I can learn how. Just some examples for self-efficacy when it comes to skill development. Shown here on the left, you could have students attend seminars like a lab safety seminar, perhaps if you're teaching a science-based course. Or there's undergraduate research workshops that students could attend just as potentially an extra credit option, and I'll provide some assignment options in a few slides. Another option is books. And so if students are into physics, here's some examples for, if it's a physics course, here's several different examples to offer for students that have books that can really connect or offer a different perspective than what's offered within the classroom. Another example is through MOOCs, so the massive online open courses. The example that I provide here is how to build a startup. So if you have a entrepreneurship or a business related course and you want to encourage students to look at what other resources might be available, signing up for a MOOC might be a good option. Next is podcasts. And so the example here is the 20 best project management podcasts. So if you have a class that really has project management as a core learning objective, then sending students out to look at podcasts, in this specific example, this would be a good place to look. Next, resourceful. So when we encourage students to increase their resourcefulness, there's two potential things to look at. On the left-hand side, there's a visual just showing, this example is for the startup ecosystem, but it's showing that there's so many resources available, whether it's companies, universities, and even throughout a university, funding organizations, service providers, research organizations, and support organizations. But more importantly, on the right-hand side is what we call a personal resource map. So when it comes to becoming, increasing those skills within resourcefulness, a first step is just understanding what students might have access to. And so encouraging students to fill in this map, and then whenever there's those white spaces, that's where they know they might have to do something differently or seek out where those resources might be. And then the third one is the growth mindset. So you could encourage students to do something like the Strengths Finder. So with the text comes an online survey that students can take through Gallup to understand what their own personal strengths are. But in the middle, there's also the Mindset by Carol Dweck. That's also a good option for students to understand what that process is like of improving the growth mindset. And then the far right is, if you haven't taken it yet, the Science of Wellbeing. It's been in the media quite a bit over the past several months. It's offered by Yale, but it's through Coursera, and this is another free course that students can just understand how they can improve or make improvements on their own for their well-being, which will ultimately help their growth mindset. So some examples are to assign students to create a concept map and brainstorm ideas for skill development, or require students to participate in a minimum of 3 skill development experiences and submit a 1-page reflection documenting lessons learned. And then moving on to the third, the ecosystem cultivation. So again, we have 3 areas. Students can cultivate their ecosystem by hooking up with mentors, attending events, and joining spaces. So just as an example, when it comes to mentoring, there's many different reasons why we might seek out different mentors. And it could be because we're looking for advice, or maybe we're looking for training, just as another example. So I would encourage students to seek out different mentors and maybe take notes and do an interview of different mentors. As an example of events, career fairs are a common experience at many universities. So this could be an option maybe for extra credit or required in the classroom that students would have to attend an event such as a career fair that's offered through campus or around campus. There's also networking on LinkedIn. So if students haven't created a LinkedIn profile yet, that's an important way to build their ecosystem. And then potentially contacting somebody to meet up for coffee just to have a chat about what they might know about the real world or even getting a job in the real world. And then finally, spaces. And the examples that I show here are co-working spaces. I'm a faculty at Purdue, so I pulled up some that are available here in West Lafayette. And these are just some examples, again, for students to develop that sense of belonging, but also to be able to connect with people and with the purpose of building that ecosystem. Some potential assignments is that you can assign students to create a mentoring map. And so in the bottom right hand on this slide is my mentoring network. And the great thing about this, and you might not be able to see it, and by the way, I'm more than willing to send out these slides if you send me an email, but in that bottom right hand corner is my mentoring network. And here it's a matter of, again, filling in the blanks. And if there's blanks that remain, then that's where students really need to seek out that guidance or seek out people to help fill in those blanks. A second option is to require students to interview or to seek mentoring advice from a minimum of 2 entrepreneurs or people that they might know from industry, and submit a 1-page reflection documenting lessons learned. So again, the purpose of this was just to provide some examples for context. So now, in going into how the interventions can be disseminated as education research. So the first step is just to decide on an intervention. So what class, what are the assignment requirements? And here I just copy and pasted some of those examples that I've just gone over. So for the value identification, skill development, and ecosystem cultivation. And so these are just some ideas, but once you've established what that unique intervention is going to be, then it's a matter of moving on to step 2, deciding on an assessment. So how will you evaluate the intervention? This could be done quantitatively or qualitatively. For example, it could be done with a pre or post survey, or even at the end of the class, a post then pre. So thinking back upon your experience, what did you know now that you didn't know before? There's many other different assessment options, but these are just some that I've listed here. The next step, step 3, is to draft a research plan. And I highly recommend doing this ahead of time. And the reason why I recommend doing this ahead of time is, for example, each semester, I put together this research plan at the beginning of the semester. And then of course I get the IRB approval in order to make it happen. But it could be 4, 5, or 6 months, maybe even a year before I look at the data again. And so by drafting this research plan, it provides some insight when you look at this potentially a year later, that you have some reference to understand what you were trying to do in the first place. So in drafting a research plan, I recommend these 6 areas. First of all, just giving it a title. And that title then essentially communicates what your main takeaway is. The research questions. So whenever it comes to education research, there's typically a research question. The how might we do something better, or what are the implications of? Next, I fill in the theory. And this could be that there is a well-known theory that's associated with it, or it could be that there's a series of literature that might be appropriate that provides some background on it. But here I just reference maybe a few citations to know what is the theory and what is the goal theoretically that I'm trying to uncover with the research. The next one is the methods. And this is a bit more straightforward. So the participants, this is depending on the class that you're teaching, it's probably, if you do this within a class, the participants will be the students in the class. The intervention, we can borrow from step 1, whatever we decide on the intervention. The assessment, which then refers to the data collection and analysis. So for the assessment, are we doing a survey? Are we going to objectively grade the artifacts? Is there a rubric that we use? That just needs to be summarized for the assessment. And then the analysis, is it going to be qualitative or quantitative? And is it something that maybe requires in vivo, for example, if it's a qualitative paper, or potentially SPSS or Minitab if it's a quantitative paper? The 5th one, which I always think is so important, is the potential anticipated findings. And why I think this is important to address up front is because we always have this so what factor when it comes to research. And so we want to make sure as we're doing this that the so what factor exists. And so here's where we put the practical implications, or really the reasons why this is important and how it's extending the body of knowledge, and why what we're doing is different from what other people are doing. And then the last one is the potential outlet. And here it could be a journal, a conference proceeding, or even the popular press that you might want to share this with. Here's an example of what I had just discussed with those 6 key areas of what this looks like before. So this is an example I think I have listed on here from fall 2018 from a class, and I just listed all of these out. And what this resulted in was 3 different publications. So this background was completed in August. The data was collected during that semester. And you can see the publication dates for some of these is that they're a year or more later, and that's for the publication. So you can imagine just how long this process takes. And that's that's one of the great things about having that draft outline ahead of time. Here's just some rules of thumb when it comes to drafting a manuscript. So first of all, the introduction. When it comes to a journal article, it typically has 5 key areas: the introduction, the background, the methods, results and discussion, and a conclusion. And so specific to the introduction, I recommend this approach, whether it's an introduction for a journal article or a conference proceeding or even the popular press. But this is also a good way to approach if you write grant proposals to provide that introduction. So part 1 is just identifying the problem. So when it comes to education research, is it because we want to broaden participation? Is it because scores or test scores are typically low within certain areas? So it's really identifying what is the problem. Part 2, what are the current solutions to the problem? So here it's important to give credit to other people out there that are also working on it, because then that helps us with part 3, is identifying the gaps. So even though other people are currently working on solutions to the problem, there's still gaps that remain. And then part 4 is this is where you propose your solution, and then you identify how it overcomes some of these gaps. And so this is also where you would list your intervention, your proposed approach, as well as your research question. With the background and literature review, again, this is just a rule of thumb. One way to approach this is to identify maybe 3 different parts. One is current approaches. So how are people currently going about this intervention or doing something comparable to the intervention? And then what are some benefits associated with it, as well as what are the challenges? And so this is going through the literature. And I think as a rule of thumb, anywhere from 15 to 20 citations would be great for this background or literature review session. And that's just a rule of thumb. Next, the methods. This typically has 4 sections. The research design or the overview, and this just provides an inclusive from start to finish. What did we have the students do? When and where did we collect the data? What types of data? And just a high-level overview. And then it's identifying the participants. How many? How many of each gender or potentially ethnicity, depending on the approach that you're using for your research question. Talking about, if it's done in a course, is it a required course or is it an optional course? And just highlighting not only the students in the course, but just talking a little bit about the course itself, if you're implementing this in the classroom. And then the data collection, here's where we provide examples of the survey, for example, if we use a survey, or if there's a rubric that we use, and we just explain how the data is collected, and a copy of the instrument. And then the data analysis is where we highlight, is it a qualitative or quantitative? And then what software do we use to enter that? The last 2 sections, the results and discussion. Here, we need to be sure to respond to the research questions. And in particular for the discussion, this should really include a compare and contrast to what's currently in the literature. And then the last part, the conclusion, is just highlighting practical implications of the study and then talking about limitations and future research. So typically for the conclusion section, I typically recommend, or for myself, I have 3 different paragraphs. One is just, why does this matter, practically speaking? And then 1 paragraph for the limitations. And usually this is related to the generalizability. And then that final one is going to be on future research. So in summary, there's two key things that I talked about. First is the teaching intervention ideas, and this is just to provide context. But there's some good ideas, especially the online discussions, that might be beneficial to you depending on what your plan is for the fall semester. And then how interventions can be disseminated as education research. So thank you for listening to me. I have my contact information here. So my email is the bosman.lisa@gmail.com. If you'd like a copy of the slides, go ahead and send me an email. And I'm usually pretty responsive within 24 hours. Feel free to check in on or connect on social media. I'd love to connect. And please let me know if you're interested in collaborating or looking for facilitation of professional development workshops. So I'm going to leave this up just for a few seconds while I look for some questions in the chat box. Actually, I have to stop. I got to stop sharing to do that. So if there's any questions that you have, so one of the questions that's listed here is, how do you know what journal to submit to? One thing that I use is this website, it's SciMago. So if you do a Google search, or it's SciMago.com or something like that. And what I really like about this website is that it lets you know if journals are, for lack of better terms, legit. So there's been a big trend recently, or probably in the past 5 to 10 years, of journals trying to make money. And so if you pay, then you just get something published. So to avoid some of those journals, we want to focus on peer-reviewed journals. And so that's one place to look. And some other journals that I highly recommend that you look into, one that focuses on the scholarship of learning, that's just more general, is the College Teaching. So that's the name of it. College Teaching is the name of the journal. And it's one, if you're just getting started, it's a great place to start because it's more scholarship focused. So it focuses more on the intervention than the research side of it, but it does require some data analysis. That was a great question. Any other questions? Thank you, Tim S., for putting that link in there. Yes, that is the SCIMAGOJR. Thank you. There's a question that I see from Manuela. Would you use the same structure to submit a grant proposal? What are good grants to apply for? So the same structure that I use is specific just to that introduction. So I think that rule of thumb for the introduction, so following on those 4 key areas, identifying the problem, current approaches to the problem, gaps in the current approaches, and the proposed solution, that's my go-to, whether it's for a journal article or for a grant proposal. But that's the only part that I essentially would cross over. Everything else is specific kind of to the grant proposal requirements. So what are good grants to apply for? If you're interested in doing education research, I recommend looking at the NSF through the education ERD, the education, or HRD, at HRD. So do a Google search for NSF and they have some education specific ones. But that being said, if you're doing like engineering education, you might want to look into the EEC or Engineering Research Center. So that's another place to look. And there's even, if you're doing computer science with NSF, there's some more specific to the computer science. So I'm just looking in the chat for some other questions. There's a Kevin, I'm currently reading How Learning Works, your thoughts and application. Oh, well, good. It's a great book, and even though it's 10 years old, I highly recommend it. It's an easy read. It has some great examples. So that text, How Learning Works. And I'm just scrolling through the chat to see if there's any other questions. So I'm just going to bring my screen back up with my contact information. I'm going to share that one more time just to make sure you have that. And again, I would be more than happy to share these slides and my contact information is there as well. So this session goes for about 3 more minutes. So any other questions that people have, feel free to put it in the chat and I'd be glad to answer those. Well, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to pass it back to Alex to see if she has any final information for you. So thank you again. I appreciate it. And again, follow up over email, and I'd be glad to share these slides.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thanks everyone for coming to this wonderful session. Just like Lisa mentioned, we are going to follow up, or sorry, she's going to follow, she's got her contact information on the screen here. You can reach out to her for the slides. There's also going to be a recording of this that would provide a bit more context to the slide, and that's going to go out from us at Course Zero via an email in a few weeks after the event. You will receive an email about that. And also, I believe I dropped the link to Lisa's profile on Course Zero in the chat. If not, I'll do that now. That's where you can find out more information about her and go ahead and follow her. And thank you again for coming. I think it's coming shortly. All right, here's that link. I'll just give everyone enough time to grab the link, and that's a wrap. I'll walk Lisa off her virtual stage now. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.